so that we can wander about a bit. And Sarah Joy, wherever you're comfortable, you can either hang out down here with me, and we can wander around, or you can stand up there so everybody can see you better. But I want to be available for you to be able to ask questions. So maybe we start with just a broad, from the things that you've heard today, from some of the conversations in your small groups, what has stuck out? What is a question that you might have that you'd be like, man, we were talking about this and it would be great to hear Sarah Joy's perspective on it, or something that she shared that you'd like her to explain a little bit more deeply or clearly, or any questions for Sarah Joy? Yes. And I'm going to come running. I need to get some exercise because I just ate 3 of those pretzels.
And do you all prefer me to be up here or down here? Does it matter? No? Okay. Then I'll just be down here.
Do you have any wisdom on working with municipal authorities?
Yeah. That's a good question.
We only have a half hour total.
Right. Oof. So I say start the conversations early with them in terms of building a relationship. Don't wait to go to the city don't wait until you're angry about something or you need something, right? Start the conversation early. Show up to support things, to be in the room as part of that discussion process. And I will tell you that actually one of the main things that transitioned me into doing what I do, to be working specifically with churches, is that as a developer, I would present projects to the city, to the neighborhood, and I had neighborhood residents show up. I had local business owners show up and speak into these ideas and these projects. I never had a representative of the local church show up. And I was like, this is a problem, because if they are part of this community, I want them speaking into this as well. And so that's where I say, show up at those meetings and be quiet initially. Just listen again and make an appointment with your city council member or, everybody has I think here you'll have boroughs. In New York, they have villages. It takes different shapes in different areas, right? But reach out and have a conversation. Those people are very accessible. You can make appointments with them. And I would say just come in and say, hey, you know what? We're the church down the road, and we just want to hear from you. What are some of the needs in this community? What are you encountering? What are you hearing? We would just like to know. And I think, again, that just posits this positive posture of hey, we're here to listen and we want to be a team player. And you're not necessarily making any promises at that point. And I tell churches, too, if you are thinking about doing some sort of larger development project with your property, again, have those conversations early and do not, this is my developer side, do not give them more information than they need. Hold your cards close to your chest, and not in a way to be deceptive, but in a way that people latch on to ideas if you start giving specificity to things early on. And if you're just in that exploratory stage, you want to just leave things very open-ended in general. So you go in and you say things hey, we have this property, and we're just kind of trying to think about, what could be some things that we might do in the future. Again, what are some community needs that you see? What type of project would you be supportive of, in this community? Leaving it much more open-ended, not saying hey, we want to do this XYZ thing, would you support that? Because they're going to latch onto that, and it's going to be harder down the road if that plan starts to take different shapes or go a different direction than you initially thought, right? So those are some of the pieces of advice that I give to churches. And again, too, I think people working in city government oftentimes are dealing with a lot of complaints all the time. And so to be that different voice that comes in and says, hey, how can we help? Or what are the things that we can do to support you in your work is very different than the majority of the people that are showing up at their offices. So I think that will go a long way too.
So you mean when we talk about loving our neighbor, we should view our township supervisors and mayors as neighbors too?
Yes.
Yeah. Wow.
I don't know if people hear
Sorry for being... But seriously,
yeah.
they don't. And I've experienced
Right.
this in conversations with our mayor in the city, just how much she and her staff appreciate the fact that we're coming and sharing. So I met with her 2 years ago to talk to her about our strategic plan, to say, here's our heart. We're still fleshing out. I've talked with her several times as it went from this kind of foggy, kind of directional thing to more specifics. And then just recently sat down with her again and her key team members to say, now the vision's starting to become more clear. Here's what we're thinking. How do we navigate this? Because we came in with that posture of like, we want to know, will this be helpful to the city? Do you view this as something the city would need and appreciate,
Right.
and it would bring value to the neighborhoods that we impact? And they're like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. And then as we got more refined in our definition of what we're going to do, the same thing. They're excited about it. And then when we said, like, we haven't navigated this road before. It's been a long time since Water Street bought a building and redeveloped it for a new purpose. And so
Right.
they're like, hey, let's introduce you to A, B, C, and D. And
Yeah.
they're going to walk with you along the way because they'd much rather do that than have you enter through the wrong door and go through. They don't want you to go through months of process
Yeah.
to just hit a wall because you needed to go over here first.
Right.
So they want to help you.
And they'll know too, like who the team players are that you should reach out to, right? Because they know, they're hearing from other people on the ground, oh, we have these needs, or oh, we're wanting to do this. And so they might say, hey, reach out to this group. They're also trying to figure out how to make this work in the community. Maybe y'all could partner together. They're going to know things like that a lot more quickly and easily. And they'll also be able to identify some of the domino effects, unintended consequences, right? You might think you have a really great idea, and then you start, maybe sharing some of that vision, and it
Like
starts.
stormwater management.
Yeah, and they might be able to say, great, but that it might, think about this, and this, and, so.
Was that helpful? Great. Any other questions?
Oh, I think right over here.
There was a, oh.
I was hoping you could share some examples from rural churches where the neighborhood isn't very walkable for practical reasons,
Right.
or there just isn't much pedestrian traffic. So
Right.
it doesn't make sense to make a path, or that it's car culture by necessity.
Right.
So like how have some rural churches thought creatively about how to bring people with cars to
Right.
or provide transportation to their space, or both?
And I think, in one sense, like some of these things, like a walking path actually can be really doable in rural areas because, yes, this is more of a destination of people driving to engage that. But at the same time, I think you have the space and the land potentially to do more of kind of either, depending on your like native landscaping or native environment, but doing some of these more like trail system type of things, or even thinking about like, is there a way to have like some sort of biking path or something like that that people can engage with if you have, again, I don't know the size of property that you have in that regard. So I think that those are some things. Also thinking about too, again, is there ways to do more of like that cultivation of land and like gardens and spaces, or like even having orchards, places for people really to enjoy and like have meditation space, because I think that's the value a lot of times too. If people in rural communities at least from the city would come, appreciate having places to go that provide some of that quiet meditation connection with nature that more rural properties would have the ability to offer. So those are some things that I think about. Yeah, I don't know if that helps.
Sarah Joy, when
Yeah.
we were talking earlier, we talked a little bit about event-based
Yep.
things and then transitioning that to more ongoing engagement.
Yeah.
But maybe in a rural environment, because it's not past, like, you're not always going past the
Right.
church in a more suburban environment or an urban environment, you might have to start with something that becomes a destination or an
Right.
event-based thing in order to get people to see your property in a different light. So you had talked
Yeah.
about Food Truck Friday
Right.
or something like
Yeah.
that. Or those, the Harvest Festival thing, where you actually have an event to get people there, but to not stay in that event-based mindset.
Right.
how do you transition
How do you
from that?
transition
Yeah.
to that? And that is harder, right? Because of the driving and it being more of a destination type of place. And so I still think it, like the event-based stuff isn't like worthless, right? Like I
Right,
think it's a
right.
very good starting point. And thinking about the event-based, I was just remembering that there's a church in, I think it's Indiana, who does this huge corn maze every year. So obviously they're growing corn on a farm next to or whatever. But they do it in such a way that like each year it has like some like biblical message. So when you like see it from the sky, it's really cool. Anyways, it's very creative, and it's gotten to be something that again is like a regular rhythm for their community. So yeah, I think thinking about, are there ways that you can do, thinking about like synergy of place again. And again, I don't have answers for all these things, but like, are there ways that when people are drawn to an event there's also other things for them to be doing or to be engaging with on a regular basis? And thinking again about like having that like meditation space that is open, that people know this is a place where I can go kind of as a retreat. And that functionally is open and available on a consistent basis, create something more than just that one-time event or that harvest festival once a year, but it allows them to use the space on a more consistent basis. Yeah, I don't know if that helps. Yeah.
Cool. See another question in the back.
Thanks. Thank you so much for all of the catalytic conversations, I'd say. One question that was rolling around in my mind is the relationship between place and the built environment as a reflection of our values. Mm-hmm. And so as we build our churches, design our spaces and places, often they come out of the values that we have.
Right.
How can we be critical about our values culturally to make sure that they align with kingdom values and not just mirror reflections of the world around us? I'm going to give you a practical example. Places can be called white places, or the quintessential what white people like.
Yeah.
Black places. These have historically been inhabited by different cultural groups. So how do we prevent that as we think carefully about deconstructing racism, other kinds of things that divide us in the creation of our spaces, so that we're not just creating more mirrors of who we are and what we think we like, but are actually pointing towards kingdom stuff? Sorry for the long question.
No, it's fine. Yeah, I think that one of the things is to tell the stories of places more explicitly. So what comes to mind particularly is one of the churches, was the church that I went to for quite a while in the Twin Cities. They are on a block and it's a very like white neighborhood, fairly affluent, but, anyways. But on their block, there's a story of a black family that moved into that block back during like Jim Crow and all that. And they effectively were forced out of the neighborhood because people like burned crosses in their yard and threw things through their front window and all this. And that history has been very lost. Nobody really on that block or in that neighborhood knew that this had happened. There's somebody who did some research, found out that this story had happened, and they wrote a whole screenplay about it. And then it was presented in the Twin Cities in various places. Well, the church found out that, there's this play, and turns out this happened on the block where we, inhabit this church now. And so what they did is they invited them to come do the play at the church. And they invited all of the neighborhood in that area to come to this play and be a part of this at the church, because they're like, we need to share the story of what happened here. We need to recognize this and like bring dignity to this black family that was really forced out of this area. And one thing I've encouraged the church to do in that, because, again, now this home is owned by a family who like has no history or tied to that story necessarily. So I'm like, you don't necessarily want to go put like a historical marker in this family, like in front of this family's house, right? But at the same time, I'm like, but you, church, you could do a historical marker on your property because you are at the corner of this block where this happened. And you could tell that story of like, hey, this is an important reminder of these are contested spaces, right? And we have to acknowledge that and recognize that. And so I think that the church has a lot of ability to really engage in some of those stories in a more legitimate way than, again, the single family home owner would necessarily. So thinking about, are there stories and histories that need to be shared and need to be told. And how are you doing that as a church to make sure that that's not lost? And I think too, thinking about, yeah, I mean, definitely there are like cultural, social preferences between like spaces and the way they're developed. And so again, thinking about that in consideration of like, what is the community makeup of your community, of where you meet as a church? And are you doing things to acknowledge the diversity and the differences within the community? And that could be, as simple as, and this might sound, I hope this doesn't sound trite, but it could be as simple as like, having signs in multiple languages and things like that, that acknowledge like, hey, we're not the only, English isn't the only language spoken at this, in this neighborhood, or people who would be necessarily walking by this church and knowing like, oh, hey, what time does the service meet? And also, like, so the church in Anaheim, too, they were in an area that was, I would say, probably more strongly Latino. And so they had a lot of Spanish speakers. And they said, oh, we would have these movie nights, and invite the neighborhood. But then they were like, we started to realize that, like, a lot of people, English wasn't their first language. And so I was like, well, why don't you show the movie with Spanish as the default language, and you put the captions in English for you to watch the movie and have to do all the reading of the subtitles, and not, your neighbors. And they were like, oh, yeah. So I think just like flipping some of those things on their head, of thinking of like, the group that might feel like the outside group. What does it feel like to be that group? And like, how are you creating the space for them to actually feel like, the main voice here, and then you're coming in, kind of as the background voice. I don't know if that answers your question and helps with some of that. It's a very nuanced thing, and I did not go into, all the zoning history and laws in our country that have created so much problems and so much racism and things like that. But that's a very real part of the history of our cities. And,
and Sarah Joy, earlier you focused on engaging the community in the creative process as well.
Right, yeah.
And so one of the key things with that is to not stay at a surface level with that.
Yeah.
Because many of our communities may still be very homogenous on a surface level.
Right.
But most of us know Lancaster County is an incredibly diverse county, and becoming more so. But sometimes you have to make the extra effort to engage those parts of the community. So like putting language up that may not be super prominent in your community, but acknowledging, even if there's one or two families that speak that language in your community, man, what an incredible kind of nod to who they are, that they're an important part of your community, that you're thinking of them, even if they're not a part of your church yet.
Right.
Or will never become a part of your church, that's okay, but you're still communicating dignity and value to them by doing that, but inviting them even into the process so that we're not ending up with those homogenous spaces that only reflect our culture. But it might take extra work. Instead of just saying, hey, let's have a community meeting,
Right.
it might take knocking on doors.
Yeah. And aesthetics will clash, right?
Yeah.
And like, at the end of the day, does it matter? I mean, like, and I'm an aesthetically driven person. I love like urban design and these things, right? But in some ways, it's like the paint color doesn't matter at the end of the day, right? What matters is if the space is designed for like human interaction and like the human scale and that sort of thing. But like the actual colors and the actual, some of the trinkets and all of those things don't really matter, right? And so why do we have to have it our way in that regard?
I rented my house that I moved out of to a good friend of mine from my church who's Dominican. And before we moved out, my wife and I are like, oh, we should repaint everything and make it really nice for Damaris when she moves in. And so we painted the house, all the typical colors we would have wanted it painted. And within like 2 weeks of being there, she's like, do you mind if I paint some rooms in the house?
Yeah. She's
like, it's so boring and bland.
Right?
Like,
Yeah.
I need some life in this house. And
Totally.
I'm like, why did we not talk to her? Like, we knew we were renting it to her. We
Yeah.
were moving out. We had bought a house. We were moving out. We connected. We're like, this is going to be a great blessing to her. And as she's getting some things back on her feet. And we didn't even ask. We're like, oh, we're doing such a nice thing for
Yeah.
her. Why not talk? And
Right.
so we bought paint in a whole bunch of other colors and let her do what she wanted to with it. And she's like, yeah. And so I walked back into the house, and I would have never lived in that house. It would have, like, I would have been wide awake all day, all night.
Yeah.
But it was her home, and it felt like her home when she was able to paint it the way she wanted.
Yeah. One thing, this is a cool story that Jonathan Brooks, I don't know if y'all are familiar with him. He's a pastor. He's written a couple of books. And we have a podcast interview that we do with him. And he's African American, grew up in an African American neighborhood in Englewood, Chicago area, right? And he said, he was like, the last thing I thought I would do is like end up back in Englewood and being a pastor. Like he went to school to study architecture. He was like, my thing was like, I'm getting out of here. He's like, and God had a different story for me, and here I am as a pastor in Englewood. But he was an architect by trade too. But he said that one thing that he found that I was like, oh, this is so cool, is he was like, Englewood was in the news all the time for like, these bad things that were happening. And what it did is it like perpetuated this idea for the people living there that like, we're worthless. This is a bad neighborhood. Only bad things happen here. And he's like, and that wasn't true. What was true is there were very good things happening too, right? There were businesses that were starting. There were entrepreneurs. There was stuff happening, but that wasn't highlighted. What was highlighted was showing up in the news. So what his church did is they started a billboard campaign. And they put up all these billboards and that had different people in the neighborhood on the billboard, and it was like, "This is Englewood. This is our story." And there were like all these positive things, and they were like the way that changed the mindset in the neighborhood because people were seeing themselves on these billboards and seeing the positive of what they were doing in the neighborhood. He's like, it changed people's minds and perceptions like crazy. And I was like, that's such a beautiful thing that your church bought a bunch of billboard space and did that, Yeah.
Next question. I'm going to give you a leading question to you, the audience, as you're thinking about what's that one thing, those two small steps that you're going to take. The thing that you, like that low-hanging fruit that you identified after one of Sarah Joy's sessions, and you went back and immediately you're like, I know that low-hanging fruit I'm going to go talk to our pastor about, or you are the pastor and you're going to go talk to your facilities team about. Who has an example of low-hanging fruit that you're going to try to take action on right away?
I think just to take my team out and walk our property and just to get them to see in the perspective of a visitor or a community person, and what does our building look like to them?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
It's great.
Great first step.
I'll be so curious to hear what they come up with. It'll be surprising, I bet.
Anyone else? What's a first step that you're going to take? How many others here are going to do that, whether you do it by yourself or you're going to invite your team to do that, to do a walk around like that? I see a number of hands. I mean, how often do we do that? I mean, even those of us who might work in our church building, like we know where we park and the door we're going to go in. I mean, I think of Water Street. We own a whole city block. We have a bunch of different buildings. But I park at 131 South Prince Street now, and I walk half a block into our first parking lot, and I go up the stairs to my office. And then I might, I'm going to go directly the most efficient route most of the time to wherever my next meeting is. How often do I walk around? During COVID, I walked around the block a lot, just for sanity's sake, and to pray. And I would walk around our entire block and just pray for all of our staff and everything. And I noticed things. Now, it's been a couple years since I did that intentionally, but just to intentionally get up over your lunch break and walk around the building and look at the building. I loved how you said, look at every nook and cranny of your building, the things that you don't notice, or your property, those of you who are blessed to have properties and not just a building. And those of you who are renting buildings,
Yeah.
What is it that you might or might not have control over, but you can talk to whoever you're renting from? But it starts with walking around. I love that as just such an easy first step. to figure out what you can do. Anyone else, low-hanging fruit that you're like, man, this is too easy. We're just gonna do it. Or you're afraid to say it out loud because we might actually ask you if you did it. Dominic.
So we have a lot of elderly in our congregation, and everyone who comes to our tiny little church tends to know, all right, that's the door you go in.
Yeah.
But it's an older church, so it's got big stairs that go up to like appear to be the big doors, and nobody uses those.
Yeah.
Everyone uses the little side door downstairs, and that's the easiest to get to. So something as simple, I want to talk to just our board and see if we can afford, the different limitations there, but things like a simple awning over that side door that everyone uses. Lighting, for the first time, because I'm only part-time, I drove past it last night. It's the first time I've seen it in the dark.
Yeah.
Because I'm only there on Sunday mornings.
Right.
And sure enough, it's all dark, and the sign out front is just a little bit of light coming. So just simple things
Yeah.
like an awning, maybe a bench by the door if
Right.
someone isn't there yet to unlock, and if someone doesn't have to walk all the way back down to their car, they can
Right.
sit down. So simple little entryway.
Yes.
kind of
Yeah.
things.
And those things are huge. Again, they just show like we care about you as a human being and your experience coming into this space.
Yeah. The wayfinding. When you talked about wayfinding, I hadn't
Yeah.
even thought about that
Yeah.
aspect of it. I thought of some of the other things, the rest spaces and yeah, just engaging. But the wayfinding, how critical that is. Because again, we've been going there for however many
Right.
years, and we know, everybody
Yeah.
there knows, nobody goes in those big doors. But if you're a visitor, if you're there for the
Yeah.
first time, those are the isn't that the entrance? It's these
Yeah.
huge doors with a big staircase to it. That's where everybody goes in.
And then you walk up and the door's locked and you feel stupid and you have to
Yeah.
walk around the stairs and you're like, I don't really know where I'm going now. Yeah.
Yeah.
And there's so many layers of mental anxiety that people go through when they're arriving at a new place. I'm sure you all have experienced that, right? Like first you're like first getting there. Okay, I get there. Okay, now where do I park? How do I navigate the parking lot? Then which door am I going into? Then what are these people going to be like? I mean, there's so many layers. And so I think the more you can remove those layers, the better. And I would say too, even put a map of your church on the website. Because that way too, people before they even come can look at the layout and understand like, hey, this is the door you go in, or hey, this is like where the sanctuary is going to be when I walk in the door. Or there's just, again, it gives people a moment to orient themselves before they're even in the space. So I encourage people to consider doing things like that. And we have a tendency too, again, to be like, oh, coffee's in like the John 3:16 room. See y'all later. Have a good, Sunday. And if you're new, you're like, the John 3:16 room, like what? Like where's that? So again, really avoiding that type of lingo when you're up on stage and inviting people to participate in other parts of the service, giving them clear direction.
Yeah. And I know some of your churches are amazing with wayfinding,
Yeah.
whether it be signage or people. And
Yeah.
people wayfinding can be even better because you can see that kind of like bewildered look on somebody's face or the hesitant
Right.
and greet them warmly. But that could really scare some people too.
Yeah, so I think having both
so having
options for the
both is a
people who aren't intimidated by the people to people,
Yeah, yeah.
and then the people who would rather just have their map and
So I want to give, as we're getting close to wrapping up here, one more chance. As you've thought about like, hey, I'm going to be bringing some of these ideas back. We do want to process some of this work as a church, but you're worrying about that first step, maybe some of those barriers or the perceived resistance that you're anticipating. Any questions related to that of like, how do you overcome some of those challenges? Do you have any specific questions around that, or I can throw it to Sarah Joy as a more general of things to keep in mind as you bring this back? Anything specific that you're like already envisioning when you go back to your church? Okay, then I'm going to pose that as a general question of like,
Yeah.
what have you encountered as you've worked with churches as some of those barriers,
Right.
and whether it's a posture or an approach or a technique to really kind of help the church understand? Because some of you are here alone today, or with one other person from your church, and you're going to go back to your leadership team and say, man, I really want us to think about this as a church. And they may not have a clue why you're even interested in it.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the biggest things that I always get right off the bat is liability. Like, oh, if we do these public improvements, what does that mean in terms of liability? And I would say, first of all, you need to check with your own individual insurance agent and broker, however that is set up in your particular locality. But a lot of times you're carrying so much insurance as a church already because effectively you are opening up your facility to the public every single week, right? So the additional insurance for things like public playgrounds or dog parks or things like that is going to be probably fairly minimal. But people love to latch on to that as kind of like, oh, but now we're going to open ourselves up to so much risk, and I think it's funny because I'm like, yeah, but you know what? Like Jesus was the wisest risk taker there is, right? And it's like, I feel like Jesus calls us to be generous risk takers. And so we've got to get out of the fear mindset. We are so permeated by that. And again, too, that doesn't mean that you're flippant or that you lack discernment, but also living from a place of fear is not going to be, it's not where things grow and blossom. They don't blossom from a place of fear. And so how can you be different from the world in that regard? And not coming from a mindset of scarcity too. Remember, we have, again, so many biblical examples of you are blessed when you bless others, right? And so again, the more we open our hands, I think the more that God returns to us in that, right? And so I think coming to terms with, things may get damaged and broken at times, and that's life. That actually means it's getting used, hopefully, right? And again, too, thinking about what are ways that one thing that we talked about that was real interesting is that they've done a skate park for have you done at different church locations? Yeah. Because, again, that oftentimes is something that pops up is like, oh, we put in these new facilities and then these skateboarders come and they wreck everything and all that. Which effectively, yes, I understand that. Like, you don't like putting money into something that gets damaged. But also the reality is that adolescents in our culture are really being like kicked out of public space in every form, right? There is not places for teenagers to congregate, and where they do congregate is often considered like negative and a bad thing. But how else do people learn to like navigate life and relationship, but to be in space with other people, right? So I thought it was like, this brilliant, right? It's like, well, we went and like set up a skate park so that they like wouldn't be skating on the church property, but we like still gave them this space to do this thing that was a valuable place for them to be in, like, so again, thinking about things like that in terms of, okay, if there are particular things that you don't want damaged in, certain ways, well, then how are you creating space somewhere where there can be room for things to be damaged, for things to, get worn out because they're being used in like a good way, right? So again, just changing that mindset.
You can even create a smash room at
Yeah.
your church.
I know, those are a
I have
thing.
a friend who opened a smash room where you get a sledgehammer and put on goggles and a helmet, and they put TVs and
Yeah.
old computers in the room. You get to smash them.
Right?
It was really popular during the pandemic.
Yeah. And then you funnel those people into your counseling program for anger issues.
then
It works out.
It's full circle. It's awesome. I'm not recommending
Yeah.
that. Don't go back to your church and say Water Street said we need to build a smash room. Did not come from me.
Yeah. So I guess those are kind of
yeah.
some of the concerns that I hear a lot of times.
Yeah. Any final words of encouragement?
I would say, and again, I don't know where you all are in your journey of, if you're at a church that's been established for a long time or like a fairly new church, but I would say that one of the things I would encourage your church to consider too, as you have these conversations and think about changes or adaptations, is that churches are where they are today because they've overcome challenges, right? And so thinking back to that like legacy of like, hey, who are we and how have we overcome challenges over the years? That's a valuable thing to like reflect on and think about like, okay, like we exist today because, you know, we had to go through changes probably with a property or with a congregation being reshaped in some way. And so reminding your congregation that like, hey, that's like opportunity for us to reorient, to think about, you know, who we are going into the future. And that's not a bad thing. You know, I think what's worse is if we adopt a retrenchment mindset of like, oh, we're just gonna like hold on with tight fists and like never change because we just gotta like stay, you know, nothing comes from being static, right? So I would just encourage you to like think back to the ways that you have overcome challenges and the ways that you've adapted and changed things as you've learned, and use that as positive reinforcement of like, hey, we can do this. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Let's give a hand to Sarah Joy.
Thank you.
So appreciated
Yeah.
your inspiration today. And I hope that today has been valuable to you as well. Really, as we begin to think about our embodied spaces, our buildings, our place in the community, and how that relates to how we love our neighbors. Again, Compelled by Love is all about how do we love our neighbors in a way that truly reflects Christ's love and invites them to take a step closer to him. And so I hope you found value from today. We're going to ask you to let us know that. So right on your tables, please, before you leave, it'll only take you literally 2 minutes